Okay, so I'm just going to go through today's, there'll be two parts. One, this is kind of what was kind of given at the prior workshops as a hands-on. I'm not going to do it hands-on with everybody today. There'll be links that you can sign up afterwards for an account and go through step by step, and I'll share the slides so you can see process on how to do various things. So the first part is just going to be giving you an idea of what an overhead of CBRAIN is and what does it do. We'll then jump into seeing some step-by-step actions on how to work with the BigBrain data using CBRAIN. And then the third part, I'm not sure if I'll have a little break in between when you want to after hearing me talk so much, is an introduction really to how we bring tools into CBRAIN. So if you're developing a tool that you're producing for, your BigBrain analysis or your HIBALL work that you eventually want to share with your colleagues or run in a different way, an easier way through a web interface, for example, there's a whole mechanism behind doing that. And I'm going to give you kind of the first taste of what part of that process is. The time we have today isn't really enough to do the full process, but we'll show you some of those beginning parts, which you can do on your own, and then we'll follow up afterwards about for the subsequent steps. So in terms of big data processing, obviously CBRAIN, lets you work with a variety of things. The traditional one, when you look at it since 2014, when the first paper came out about what CBRAIN does, it was all working with neuroimaging data. And was giving people a choice. Normally you would go through, you learn to use computing systems, you're learning to use it on the command line, you're trying to figure out, okay, how to download your software, how to build your software, how to copy and upload your files. And the intent is not for you to see the contents of the screen, but it is an actual session where somebody's running a Python notebook to analyze some imaging data. But, the idea was we also want to, reduce the barrier to entry and make it a little bit easier for people to focus on the science, but still obviously learning some of the web-based technologies to make things easier and more powerfully. And that's where, like I said, we want to have a web UI and where CBRAIN comes in. The CBRAIN portion gives you an alternative pathway. It does have pieces where it lets you use the command line for, if you want to use the API layer of CBRAIN, which I won't really highlight other than gloss over later on. But what CBRAIN does is really lets you work with your data, and it orchestrates it such that you can actually then, through that web interface, see your files, work with your files, select from an inventory of tools that we have available in the system, and then send those for, to be processed on computing resources. And this is just a slide that I was showing on campus a couple of weeks ago, where most of the audience was just connected to the high-performance computing systems here in Canada. But of course, this is a globally connected research environment. So it could be in Ulich, it could be elsewhere where the computing resources reside. And the whole intent of it is to not only, obviously make it easier from a web UI point of view, but you also want to be able to scale out your work, right? So you're not just working with one subject at a time. You also particularly want to not only scale it up, you want to also be able to collaborate and share with your colleagues and say, okay, well, not just say, okay, get an account on this, and then you can share and figure out, sharing settings. And if you're directly logged into the system, you're going to be doing things like different permission settings. It can be quite convoluted, but CBRAIN takes care of, let's say, those pieces, provides a single pane of glass view where you can make it much easier to do that sharing. But then you also really, like I said, want to make it reproducible. And that's one of the key things with regard to how CBRAIN provides in terms of the services. It has that very clear relationship between data, the tool, and what you produce as output. And you can go back and find it. You don't have to worry about digging to try and really find that. The nice thing is, because it started from a neuroinformatics point of view, you can also apply to other. This is an example of cardiac MRI. So this is what some of our colleagues and all are using it, want to be using it for. And for anything, essentially, the way CBRAIN's constructed, all the technologies were agnostic. So, for a different audience, if you're looking at different, say, modalities or different data types, whether it's chemistry, engineering, as long as you can do certain things in terms of containerizing your tools, which I'll talk about later on, you can use CBRAIN for doing the processing and the data management pieces. As part of the overall workflow, if you look at it, users come in through the web UI. You're going to be working with, like I said, data that's going to be residing in some space. In this case, particularly, the BigBrain data is coming in from a number of sources. It was, you have different plugins that let people connect into imaging data, genetics, epigenetics, behavioral, all the way through. But what you're going to be doing within the web UI point of view is you're connecting to CBRAIN, which is going to orchestrate the flow between not only wherever your data may reside, but also it lets you select the tool, like I said, and runs it on the computing systems which are connected. And the nice piece is you don't have to worry about replicating large data sets that you may be interested that other people are using. For example, we have connection points with something called Canadian Neuroscience Platform. So that way it's a common repository of open data sets. We have the UK Biobank and anything that's connected down the back end of the technology called Data Lab, which I won't go into. But anything in terms of a federated data space can be connected into CBRAIN, and people can use the tools that are there to do this analysis on that data. So what, like I said, it gives you is an opportunity to see within a single pane of glass view. So I'm sorry if you can't see this very clearly, but in this case, it shows you all your tasks that you're running. Not only that, you can actually then drill down to see the status of each one, and we'll get a deeper dive into showing how some of this works. You can actually then be connected to multiple systems. It's not just one massive server or a large server you're connected to. Everything in CBRAIN is federated. So the compute resources, the data, it's all distributed across the globe and potentially on how you're connected. But what it provides is a single view into it all. So it can be fully distributed, but as I said, it simplifies it into, you don't have to worry about the complexity of each one. And the nice thing is that you can get that singular view, but then you also have directly within it embedded visualization capabilities with something called Brain Browser. That's one of the visualization tools directly accessible within CBRAIN. And then you can do things such as, the volumetric or the surface viewing. This is just one example of what Brain Browser is capable of doing. So in terms of the tools, like I said, there's around 120 different right now covering the full spectrum of neuroinformatics analyses. I'm not, by my design, I'm more of a computing and software person, so I don't necessarily understand all the ins and outs of each one of these tools. Nonetheless, though, they're all really brought together by supporting using the standard base. The standard base is meaning that all the tools are containerized, so they're highly portable, which I'll talk about later on. We use something called boutiques to standardize how we describe the input and output parameters. So this is how we generate the web interface that you see, where you can actually just pick and choose the values of various things. You'll see that in the hands-on exercise. And then the CBRAIN portion manages that workflow. It moves the data if it needs to, brings the task to wherever you want it to launch, wherever the data is. So then you can make those decisions in terms of the flow of doing the analysis. And like I said, I would say for some cases, so this is, I would say, the normal view, what users actually do. They log in, they can do their session management. But this is all stuff that you normally do for the web interface, but all of this is also available through the API side. So people doing notebooks, we have a number of projects where people are using the direct APIs for CBRAIN. So they can run a notebook, they can load their data sets in, they can control their session, and they're using CBRAIN to provide access to the files, but they're also then running interactive data analysis for things like scikit-learn, or they can do some analysis with whatever variety of tools they want within a notebook environment. And that's, again, like I said, leveraging all the things that CBRAIN has available to us. Of course, there's some things that we keep augmenting and improving on the API side. So it's meant there to provide, I would say, more of a power user interface to what CBRAIN can provide. Like I said, in terms of the data sets that are there, we have UK Biobank. That's a large one there. Of course, that one's, I would say controlled access because of the nature of the data that's there. We have open ones, as I said, for the CMP, so you can actually then browse, and we have a button that says process on CBRAIN, where you can actually then just click on that button there. It'll bring you to a menu to select the tool. Some of that's going to be updated a little bit to make it a little bit better matchmaking between the tool and the data. Other ones, like I said, we have a lot of people using the Human Connectome project data, so we provide that actually as a single point of access to that data. Of course, having to prove that people can use it, are allowed to access the data, but also for other projects like ABCD. And what we do now, particularly, this is a bit old. These are all at the time, the CMP data sets that are available in CBRAIN. We've changed this to have a more, I would say, condensed and streamlined looking view. So the idea behind this, though, of course, CBRAIN, it's not working in a silo. It's working together with other components. Like I said, the Open Neuroscience Platform. It's also working together with Data Labs, working together with Loris. And the idea is you want to, have interoperability, and you have interoperability between those different services to make sure that people can actually work together themselves. And so that interoperability is key. And so we take as the foundation things like CBRAIN and together with Loris. Those are really the two pillars. And in the end, from a user point of view, you want to be able to do a variety of things. And we provide those through services to let people do their data management, to do the processing. And of course, for the data management, you can have choices of very simplified, I would say, or straightforward data management that things like CBRAIN provides, or you can have also very structured data management capabilities through Loris. The processing, of course, is all done through CBRAIN. You want to be able to share, and then you also want to be able to explore and work with it. And of course, going forward, there's new emerging services that do publishing, and all within something called NeuroHub, which is also coming out of here at McGill, is really the collection of those pieces that bring together the different service points, whether it's, as I said, the different technologies are brought together. People come in through one portal gateway called NeuroHub, and then from there they can traverse into the different components. So it's really more of a, like I said, NeuroHub's a gateway view into those different components. Of course, there's different particulars that it's providing in terms of, say, feature specific capabilities. But like I said, the two foundational ones are coming from CBRAIN and OS. So from hopefully from this, I know it's only been a few minutes, but the idea of together these tools that people do worry about and work on big data, they can actually do the analytics on the computer and compute on that, and then work together. And some of the things that we won't see necessarily directly, but like you get an account, you'll be able to see that there's ways to facilitate collaboration. And of course, depending on the project you're working on, it lets people work across a diverse range of, say, health research activities, but not just in health research itself. So it's really forms of what we call a core infrastructure and services for science. And one of the things that we try and really emphasize is that it's really essential tools that provide the ability for reproducibility and interoperability, right? Using the containers, using the different elements, we're building upon standard connection pieces, so it makes it easier. And again, as I said, the general piece, CBRAIN is completely general and can be used even beyond brain science. So we really wanted, what we try to do is interoperate or integrate, not re-implement things. So these are just, I would say, some follow-up links, but again, they'll come out in the slide deck afterwards. Of course, this was due to work of a lot of, I would say, people, both past, present, and of course, going forward, other projects are continuing to move along to advance the capabilities that we have. So that would say the CBRAIN in a nutshell. So what we're going to go through now is just some hands-on. The title slide here mentions with data lab. We're not going to be really using the data lab that was in the prior sessions that was given in during the actual HIBALL workshops. So we're going to focus today on just using NeuroHub and CBRAIN. That's an older time estimate, but it'll be a lot quicker than that, since we're not going through interactively, everybody trying it themselves. So what we're going to go through is a series of exercises. We'll skip exercise 7 for today, but just to go through and show you how to connect, how to navigate and find the data sets. And we're going to be using a tool called BigBrain Work, which was developed out of Boris Bernhard's lab here, which works on BigBrain data. Just to give you an example of the flow of working with the system, how to then monitor things that you're running task-wise and look at the outputs. And of course, not only just work on one file, but you want to work on many files. So we'll give you some examples of how to do that. So if you haven't already or heard about NeuroHub or CBRAIN, the easiest way of getting connected, if you do have an account or if you don't have one yet, is just go to our website, portal.neurohub.ca. That's just the direct login. You also have, you can just go to neurohub.ca or CBRAIN.ca. You have just more general information about the platforms, but this is I'll say the entry point for your user access, whether to sign in or to create a new account. So when you sign in and then you do get an account on our portal, you'll get a dashboard view. This one is maybe just from last year. It looks the same, but maybe some of the information on the news side will have changed. To get a dashboard view that provides you with a quick and easy access to moving between your various projects that you may be either working on yourself or have been shared with you. You can also connect your own connected storage devices, but we won't talk about that in today's session. You also have quick links to your accounts if you want to change your password for any reason, as well as links to our documentation. But the idea here is we present a quick entry point that lets people navigate. We're doing some modifications now that will reorient this to be a complete gateway into the different services I mentioned in the prior slide deck. So this is the view that we can present on the portal. The idea was, we're talking about working with the BigBrain data sets. So we have a quick link that shows you what list of data sets are available. So if you click on that link, you don't need to have an account to actually see this, because we want people to be able to discover the data sets that are there, as well as the tools that are available. So we have a page that shows the available tools and data sets. And then you can see right there, there's a variety of ones, but the COMP, BigBrain, because it's shared through COMP's services, so data line on the back end into CBRAIN. There. So that's the one we're going to be working with today. Again, like I said, if you already don't have an account or you don't need to log in, you just go to the one page where it shows what's available and you can discover this without logging in to understand, see what tools or other data sets are there. So you can go back to the main dashboard. The nice piece is that you can actually do, if you know the data set you're working with, it's great, but then you can also do some quick searches. So within the search box, you can discover what things are there. But what we're going to do in this example is say, if you're a first-time user of the system, you're going to create a project. Just basically to maintain an organized structure for the file that you've worked with before or you're planning on working with. But you might want to keep them separate from your other projects that you've been part of. So if you click on projects, it'll bring you to an interface where you can see your existing project that may exist for you or the ones that exist that you're able to access. And we also have a menu that shows add project. So if you click on the add project, it'll bring you to another tab where you just specify the name. In this case, I just gave a name for doing BigBrain work, calling my first BigBrain project. There's a couple of options there in terms that you don't need to. You can leave them blank. Most parts is whether you want to make it public or not. That's just one extra feature we have. It's not a default. So then that's all I have to do is really get started to create a project. You give it a name, you give it a description, and then you're moving forward. So that way it's just a way of keeping compartmentalized and organized your particular activities. So clicking on create, you always get a nice thing. Every time within either the NeuroHub side or the CBRAIN side, when you're launching a task, you get like a green menu bar that pops up and gives you the status of whether something was launched for work or started for work or successfully completed. So in this case, once I created the project, it was instantaneous, or it gave me a message it was successfully created. So you can see some of the current metrics about the project itself. For example, because this is a brand new project that I created at the time, there's no files in it, right? There's no tasks that have been associated with it. There's only one member, me, myself. But you have a lot of options where you can actually invite other users. So if you have colleagues that you want to work on the data files together or share information with, you can invite them to join the project. You can use the interface to upload project files that you're saying working on separately. You do a variety of things. So we just want to highlight the flexibility that it provides. So we're going to go back to the dashboard now. So this is where we're going to use this project spaces to really store the results of the outcome of processing that we want to do with the data. So we're going to go back to the dashboard. And on that dashboard, like I said, we know already that there's a list of data sets available, so I'm just going to go back. But rather than going to the list, I say, well, I know I saw one before that said CMP BigBrain. It's just an overlay here. You can type it directly into the search field, so you can search a variety of things. It's just a free formatted search. It'll give you your tasks or your data sets that you have access to as well. We knew the one we want to work with, the COP-BigBrain. Clicking enter, then it'll give you all the results that correspond to that. And because these are all, these are data sets that are read-only, right? Because they're configured in the system through the CMP side of things, but they're pulled in and made visible to CBRAIN. Technically, they're only pulled in when you're accessing them. So here's the search result that we saw. So like I said, there's a variety of BigBrain data sets here, but the one we're going to work with is the first one, CMP BigBrain. And then you can see the different information. You can tell how many users are actually, it's not who have access to the files, but it's just basically who owns and maintains it. And then you can tell the number of files that are in it. In this case, it's 317. So if I click on the actual CMP-BigBrain name, that'll bring me more information about the actual project, because each of these themselves are projects. So as I said before, there's 317 files, username, and it gives you the description of what's information there. If you really want to start poking around and seeing what the contents are, you click on the files piece, and then you'll start getting a listing. And depending on the listing, you'll get them in a certain order. But of course, this is not necessarily easy to work with because you're going to get all the files. So again, let's see, there's multiple pages here. So I'm showing in this display default 20 per page out of 317 possible ones. You need to know and understand the data set. This is not intended to give you information about the data set. It's just to give you access. And so you'll have to have some fundamental understanding from other source information about what the BigBrain data set is made up of, what files are there, what data types. So then you can decide which particular ones you want to look at. For the purposes of this, it's actually easier to navigate by going through the CBRAIN side of things. So that's what the CV in the top left corner does. So you can get basically an equivalent view from the CBRAIN portal side by clicking on the CV at the top left. you get the equivalent view for that particular, from that orientation. So you can see again the same thing, whether it's the file name, the file type. You can see there's a variety of different file types contained within this register data set, and it gives you information about sizes as well. For the purpose of this exercise, we're going to work with one particular file type, and you can see the different file types, and you can even filter them by clicking on the magnifying glass next to file type, and then you can see the breakdown. Some of them are just a JSON file, a bunch of them are MINC files, other ones are Nifty files. We're going to work with the MINC files in this particular case. And if you want a nice filtered view, all you have to do is click on the MINC file portion, and then it'll give you a different view, a singular view that only shows in that the MINC files correspond to the data set. Additionally, I also want to filter this down a little further. We're going to work with just the grayscale, the 8-bit images. So I put another description. Again, this goes back to knowing more about your data set. Right? This is stuff that's not going to be shared within CBRAIN itself. You'll need to go to the BigBrain data site to get more information about that part. But in this case, those were the data pieces that I wanted to look at. So you can see in the top left, or the top left here, I have what are called active filters. So I've done two things. Again, I've selected the file type that I want to look at, which is the MINC files. And then I also wanted the ones that start with a full 8 underscore. So now I've done my filtering, and I've gone from 317 files before, and now I'm down to 13 different entries. So these are the entries that correspond to that selection. So of course, they're all MINC files. And you can see that there's the different resolutions available, so that way you can decide, okay, which one of particular interest. And what I decided in this case, just to show the workflow, I was going to take the 200 micron data. So on the left, you can see a checkbox. If you click on the checkbox, that's more later for processing part, but what you can do individually is click, these are just again behind the filters, but I'm going to just say to click on the file name, the full 8 underscore 200 micron data, then it'll bring me to another page just giving me more information about that file. Provides two sets of information. One, not only about, of course, what it really is in terms of the MINC file, its size, and so on, who the owner is, what project is part of, and so on. But it also provides directly within this, using Brain browser, a direct imaging view within the browser. So you don't have to actually download the file, use a separate tool for doing the imaging. You can actually traverse the slices and get all the coordinate information as you do that. So that's all directly within the browser, so that way you don't have to, like I said, download anything directly to your local computer. Of course, this is just a Brain browser. There's other, of course, imaging tools that you want to download these otherwise, but these are the ones that are we have within there. So you can also switch between the, I guess this is the volume viewer, so then you can also switch to other ones. There's a surface viewer as well for people. So that's directly within view. So you get a nice interactive way of browsing the file, looking at the file without, again, having the additional step of downloading to your computer, waiting for the network to download. This is not a small file, and it's not that small. You know, at least with the networks as they are today, depending on what you're connected as, it doesn't take too long, but depending on where you are, it may take some time. So what we're going to do now, though, is we're going to do some analytics on this particular file. So the important thing that you're going to want to do is do the checkbox beside it. It means you're going to select that file for some form of processing. So you can see that like I said, I've just marked one, and this is again where the project is residing in the CMP BigBrain files. So now I'm going to launch. So this is where if you click on launch in the top left after you've selected the file, it'll bring you to a menu of basically where you can select the tool. Now we have different categories. So in this case, I would say I knew ahead of time. I cheated because I typed in the BigBrain. I was going to use the BigBrain more. But if you wanted to say, okay, I don't know, if you didn't remember what tool was available, you could do a selection based upon the different types of tools that you may want to be using. If you want to be using some that will just do conversion or other types, this will then filter down to present you a list of tools that correspond to those particular types of analysis that you would want to do. Or, as I said, if you just know the name, you could type the name in the search box, and it'll do an autocomplete to show you what really matches to that. So in this case, when I typed in BigBrain, I got BigBrain more. It'll present to you a number of things, including not only where, the different connected servers, where that version is available, and also what versions of the software are available. So if you're going to be using say one that's newer, or if there's a specific one you want to rerun with analysis, then you can pick that from there. So in this case, this is one from August 2022. Then that's the only one that's also so we wanted to run that. You can just click on launch BigBrain more. And that'll bring you to a next page that'll let you do the first of two things. There's two parts you're going to be running next. One is called task control, meaning how you want to control CBRAIN to do the workflow orchestration. To do that, you can see already we've selected the server and the version, but then you have to decide where do you want to store results, right? This is not the project part, but this is meaning a storage, I would say location, right? And within CBRAIN, we provide a default amount of space for people to use it as a temporary parking lot. If you had connected storage, you could select it to be on your own remote server somewhere if you had that connected in. But in this case, we're just going to select it to be part of the main general storage of ZBrain. Then you're also going to select the project. In this case, I have multiple projects, but I'm going to see what you don't see here is there's actually, if I click on the arrow, I'll get a menu to choose where I want to select the output to go to. In this case, because at the very beginning, I created a project called BigBrain Research. That's the one I want to set it to. So that's, I would say, the orchestration, the task control part. So that just tells you, okay, the tool I'm using, where do I want the output results to go? The next part you want to be able to specify, though, is everything is all the parameters that correspond to the actual tool itself, right? So this is where the BigBrain work tools, and we'll see later on when we're talking about tools, we have the tool that's in container form. We have something that's called boutique descriptor that helps us then in CBRAIN present the web interface. And this is the web interface for the BigBrain work one, for at least one set of it. So you're going to choose the input space. Again, if you use the arrow key, you'll see the list of options that are available. The ones that are used for this demo. In this particular exercise, it's just a conversion from the BigBrain space into ICBM space. That's all that's happening with this tool. So it's just doing that conversion. So you select the input space, ICBM, the output space. Again, we have a help menu that gives information about what it means for each particular part. In this case, like I said, you can see what BigBrain work does in the background by looking it up. You have a space where you can actually give some information just as a descriptor. This is a free form, so anything with obviously the red asterisks are mandatory. So I just give it as I'm running it. In this case, I ran it originally in October of 2022. And because I selected now, remember I selected the 200 micron data, I'm just giving a dash 200 at the end just so I know which one I'm using. Then in this case, it was also requiring a license for free surfer, which I had also in my file. I think the new one, the latest installation of this, we don't require this particular portion of the step. Again, I selected the spaces. These are all the mandatories, the license. There's another part where I can actually then, because it automatically is populated, coming from the fact that I checkboxed before. On the previous slide, I selected the checkbox for full 8_200 micron. If that is automatically populated based upon the selection I did prior. Then you can see some of the optional other parameters that may or may not be available, depending on what particular tool you're in. So these are all the ones that you have to do in the BigBrain work case. So I filled out the mandatories. I've automatically seen it populated this input file that I want to use. Now it's ready to start. So now you see in the bottom right. Again, this is only a view in one page. It'll be a little bit oriented layout-wise a little differently. So when I select start, it'll shift you then not from the file part, which is what we were working with before. It'll bring you in what's called the task view within CBRAIN. Task view will present a menu at the top, or a menu at the top where you can navigate between different pieces. But also because I just launched the task after setting the parameters, it'll give me a message saying it's launched a task in background. And then you can see that in your list. So it'll show you a list of tasks that you've run prior. So you can see in my case, at that time, I had different other prior tasks that I completed, but the one I just submitted at this time will have a first state of new. So meaning it just got newly submitted to the system. And the nice thing with CBRAIN is it'll give you a progress. You can, depending on how you refresh it and so on, it communicates where the task is being run, and it can actually then get state information going from new all the way through to the end. So for example, if I check on later on, so it gets scheduled. So if it gets submitted to an HPC system, it doesn't mean it's going to run instantly. On the server, we are doing it here, it just runs it very quickly. But once it's on CPU, it means it's been scheduled. It's actually in execution. So it's actually been processing. So you'll see that phase coming up later. Then once it goes on CPU, it should change into eventually completed. And then we can see the task that you ran, that you submitted, came to completion, and you say, okay, great, now I can go and inspect the results. And you also get a message bar at the top indicating that task because it was completed, and you can also see the time it finished as well. And you can dismiss the message and you'll list that there, depending on how many you're running, you don't want to have them all. So the nice part is, well, you can say, okay, I run this process type, I want to go look at the output, right? All you have to do is go on to the task type name, you click on the output name, and much akin to what you saw for the input parameters before, you get information about the task that you just ran. So it converts, in this case, where it ran. So in this case, was running directly on one of our servers because of the low CPU task. We run it directly in the CBRAIN side on one of our own systems. It ran to completion. It tells you the size of the output directory that was created, when it was produced, what projects it's part of. And then you can also do other interesting things depending on the size of the output, because there's sometimes limitation. There is a limitation on that side that we can push this out. There's also ways you can publish this particular output as a node. So if you want to reference something later on in the publication and other work, you can actually do that as well. So that's the information. Then you can dig down and get a lot more details. So if you want to say, okay, if you're trying to debug something, this one ran to completion successfully, you say you want to inspect some information in logs, but you can see a summary of the parameters. So this is the nice part of that, I would say that provenance part, and knowing the relationship between the input data, the task, and the output. You know what input data you're working with. I've seen this input volume here. It's recorded the input files. You see the output directory, and then you know exactly which version of tool that you're working with as well. And so this is the summary view. You can also get more precise raw information in terms of things like log files. So if you want to go through and inspect the logs, all these are directly accessible through the CBRAIN interface, where you can then go through step by step and see exactly how that processing occurred and the logs that were generated using that particular tool. So for example, you want to see, if you're trying to debug something, all the standard error, standard out messaging, you can see all that detail again directly within the logs. You can download these later if you want to do some particular filtering or searching on it. They're all maintained directly and accessible through CBRAIN. Similarly, also you can do things like looking at the output files. So much akin to what you did for the input files. If you click on the output files, you can get information about not only what was created, but you can also see the created contents. So in this case, the particular output file, you want to take a look at it. This second one, that was one of the ones that was produced. You can then click on it because itself is a main file. You can then directly visualize the output. Within the browser. You don't have to download it. It's all directly viewable within the browser. Like I said, the nice part is there you see that relationship again, input data tool and the produced output, so that we come back 6 months later or 3 months later or even a year or so later, that relationship still persists. Getting toward the end of this now, that's great for one particular file. You want to run this more on many at a time. That's the nice part. You don't want to say if you're selecting 10 or 100 or 1,000 different images that you want to process, you don't want to go through to select each one of those one at a time, repeat 1,000 times, for example. What you can do is just use a feature we have in CBRAIN to essentially do en masse one submission for the collection that you want to process. So in this case, just to show that example of launching BigBrain work on multiple files, I've done another filter. I've still kept it on the main files that I want to work with, but then I wanted to say some of just a block of images here. I just did a particular pattern that I knew. Again, this goes back to knowing your data set and what contents are there. So I did that filter then, and I came up with these 9 different entries. Say I wanted to process all of these. So that's, again, showing what the filter was. I can select them all, but rather than going directly to launch, what you want to do is, you have the nice capability of this within CBRAIN is you have the ability what's called a CBRAIN file list. You would then create essentially an entry in a file that corresponds to each one of these input data files. So on the top right, then you'll go to more, and then you one called create a file list. Like I said, this file list is then what is going to be taken. So when you create the file list, It takes the information corresponding to all these particular images. So you can see the names. The ID is an internal CBRAIN name. It tells you information about the size and so on. So basically puts these all into a CSV file. And what that CSV file is going to let you work with, instead of taking the image as an input to see in a BigBrain work, you're going to be able to, CBRAIN takes it and passes in the CBRAIN file list. So that way it then manages to say, okay, for each row, I want to process a separate task, but you don't have to do it separately. You just do it once, taking this file. So when I do that particular CBRAIN file list, in this case, not only do I have, say, for example, now in the project, in my project, I have the output that I ran on the first process, but then I also now have not only my, say, in my case, the license file, but I also have what's called the CBRAIN file. So CB CSV, the CBRAIN CSV. So now to run that with 9 tasks, I don't do it 9 times, I do it once by checkboxing the file list. I was also checkboxing the free server license, and then I'm going to select launch, because those are the 2 files I want to actually take as inputs. So if I select launch with those, again, I do the exact same process I went through before. So the BigBrain, the tool, I want to launch it. Everything works the same. I'll do my task control the same way. This time I'm going to store the data put on our central storage again, but I'm going to put it in my project. All the task parameters are the same, but the description field I can change, so just to make it so I'm cognizant and looking back afterwards that I was taking this input as the CBRAIN CSV. So I changed just the last part of the description, so that's CBRAIN CSV. And so those are the mandatory fields. But then if you notice, because just like in the first example of the running one file, I put that name of the one file in. In this case, I'm giving the one file the CBRAIN CSV. That's what it's populating in the input volume. Even though in itself it's not a volume, but its contents, each row is corresponds to an input volume. So then I do the launch backwards, sorry. So I've set those values. And I'm going to do start, and then it's the same idea now. It launches, it says it's launching, but now because there was 9 rows in that CBRAIN CSV file, it says right at the top, launching 9 BigBrain work tasks in the background. The nice piece, particularly within CBRAIN, even though I've submitted it as one through because I'm processing the CBRAIN CSV, it gives it as a single entry, but then you notice the difference here now. There's a plus sign on the left-hand side next to the task type. That means that there's essentially a collection of processing tasks in the launch. And you can see the stats in the sense is different as well. It's not just saying new, but it's 9 times new. One corresponding for each particular file in the list. And if I click on the arrow, you can watch that as well as the changes go through. So instead of saying 9 are new, now it's going 9 on the CPU. They go from the start executing, and then I can actually click on the plus on the left and I can get an exploded view that shows each of the individual ones. So sometimes, depending on what you're submitting, some of these may start at different times, depending on what resources it needs. So that way you can see the individual status of each subtask within the submitted task. Again, you can then watch that go through all the way through to completion. It gives you a message at the top when the system has finished processing it all. And then you can then go particularly look at each individual one if you wish to examine the particulars in the outputs. So now if I go back to my project directory, not only do I see before, which was one particular output, right? The first one is BigBrain Morph at the second from the top list from my file list. But I have other ones now that will produce corresponding to each of the 9 particular processings that occurred. So that's the part there. Let's see here. I don't think I'm going to go to the download because it's easy to download. I think that's the part I'll leave for now.
So, Bryan, one quick question.
Yes.
So you showed how to create a file list and to process that file list. What's the difference between clicking on the files and then launching?
Depending on how the tools can be, you can do that. But if this file list is particularly, if you can fit it all in with one view, but as you might have seen before,
several pages.
There's like several pages, like 16 pages. And if you change the display to say from instead of 20 to 500, then you have to individually click each of the ones that you want to select, or you say select all. This way you produce the filter, creates a file list, and then it also has a record that file list persists. What you clicked on doesn't persist in terms of an easy reference point later. Whereas you come back later on and uses it, it has a record of knowing that the file list was there. So you have complete record of what those contents were rather than if you just clicked on it. Of course, that's stored in the output file as well. But it's just from a, I would say, also a recognition point of view, it lets you repeat the task much easier. Then you have to go through and repeat the clicks to do that. And some tools work differently. Then you don't have, some you can click, some of them it's better to just use the CSV. I think that's not a good answer. But...
Thank you.
That's then, again, downloading is easy. You can download some things depending on the size of the files directly from the browser. We also have a number of ways where you can actually connect through what are called SFTP, Secure File Transfer Protocol entries into CBRAIN. And that way you can then use those entry points to do, let's say, large either volume uploads or downloads. If you want to take lots of data down or put lots of data up, you can then use whatever tool you want. So in this case, you don't have to do it all through the browser. The browser is not very efficient for doing things massively uploading because then it can take lots of files or even similar for downloads. But if you do it through an interface with whatever you're most familiar with, I was using something like your CyberDeck, I can actually then connect to CBRAIN, select my data that I want to download. This is an example for another project. Then I was able to pick and choose exactly which ones I wanted to upload and download. It was very easy. I can just drag and drop because these tools are purpose built for that. The point with CBRAIN though is we provide the interfaces for those tools to speak with. So you get to use the interface you want for that data in and out for large scale volume data. And then CBRAIN just provides a nice endpoint that makes it work. So there's a variety of options for connecting. You just need to know the specific parameters, and this is documented in the web pages as well. That shows you at least the download capabilities. But in a nutshell, shows you, like I said, the process of working with your data file, finding it. Of course, again, you have to know about your data, more information. How you filter the files that you want, and then selecting the tools and going through that workflow of data input, tool, and data output. Whether it's one file or many files. You can see that you can do one file with one series of steps. With the same series of steps, you can do as many files that correspond to your particular, say cohort of interest or group of files of interest. If there's any questions, you can reach out to us by email or talk to me afterwards. This goes into our support queue. Thanks for your attention for this part.
So all the tasks that we run on CBRAIN are run on Compute Canada servers?
It depends on where you pick them. So we have allocations. So once they're done here we're very quick conversions. So those, because they only ran for a few minutes, you don't want to use the high performance computing systems of the Alliance and Compute Canada because they go into a queue. And that queue is not an instantaneous execution. It goes into something called based on priorities.
Like Slurm based?
It's all Slurm based, exactly. Mm-hmm. So that will submit the job on behalf through CBRAIN to the Slurm queue. Mm-hmm. And that's so much akin to what you saw with the status of being new on CPU and completed. That same information is queried and brought back from talking with the Slurm queuing system on those machines.
And within the CBRAIN client, we can allocate resources for our tasks?
These are using the default allocation, which is under the allocation for CBRAIN at the moment. But if you were, say, part of a research group that has their own allocation, we can configure those in for you in CBRAIN such that you can tie them in. So rather than seeing just the menu of options, you'll be able to drop down and see, okay, I'm going to use my allocation that belongs to Professor so-and-so. You make that choice. As long as you're entitled, of course, and are a member on it, then you have an option. So say if you're part of different projects, different groups that have different allocations, that would show up in the menu. Okay. So that way you can pick and choose, because sometimes you're going to use the common shared allocation, which may or may not be busy, depending on the time you're using it. But if your particular group membership lets you be part of another professor, we can add that into CBRAIN, so that way you get a different view compared to someone who was just using the general allocation.
Right. And the part that Bryan will not discuss today, which is the UISH systems that you can also use as being part of HIBALL.
Perfect. And we're also looking to get the Icelandic.
Yes, and the Icelandic.
So the next part, say the second part of this, is to show you some basic information about how going beyond. So in this first case, I was showing you how to use different pre-existing configured tools within CBRAIN. This step now is more oriented, like I said, towards actually on the process of how to bring your scientific tool or that you might be developing or have developed into CBRAIN itself to make it, like I said, accessible through the web interface so that people can then launch it. So the outline is this as follows. We're not going to go through the full end-to-end process, but the key thing that we're going to want to learn about and do some basic parts of understanding is using containers. So I'm just going to say a few words about what a container is and what types we use within CBRAIN, and of course what are some of the advantages. I'll highlight some of the process that is for behind containerizing an application. I'll just be using some simple examples. These are not ones particularly oriented toward maybe on the neuroinformatics side, but I'll have some pointers to the ones at the end as part of what the process is. Then I'll give some examples of that. And at the end, there'll be some, say, both from myself as well as from some of my colleagues, based on all the containerization that they've done. They are the people who are more experienced than I on this part. But just some things to be keeping in mind and considerations, meaning best practices, and particularly if you want to bring your container into CBRAIN. So the highlights of what will be covered here. So the first part is really, what is a container? Just if you want to think of a container, again, think of it as a way of packaging something into a sandbox. Like you're taking yourself out of just the rest of the system of a computer system, and you're just putting everything that you would normally run on a machine, but you're putting it in such a way that it's isolated from the rest of the system, right? So it's something that's self-contained and it's separate from, if you're just logging into an HPC system or a computer system where you're just running a process at a time. It's something that's isolated and separate. But it's fully self-contained, like I said. So you can run it and it keeps everything what's called in an image. Okay, so you can create the images, you can then start them, stop them, move them. And you can do this from the command line and other programming tools. And the nice thing is that you can actually then move this container around. Right? You can move it, you can run locally on my laptop. I was doing some, that once elsewhere in the lab I was running. Containers, then you can then eventually migrate them to be running on HPC systems. Once you do a particular conversion of those containers, you run elsewhere in the cloud. So it makes it very, very portable. And like I said, the idea is that it's isolated from other containers as well. There's some caveats to, I would say, its scope of visibility, particularly if you're dealing with Docker. There's some things you have to keep in mind. But one of the key things is that it keeps all its software that it needs to use. So all its dependencies, its configurations, everything, libraries, it keeps it all together and isolated in one package for a variety of images that get overlaid. So think of that as a collection of everything that is everything self-contained. And I use the word images. The thing particularly about when it comes to something called Docker, and that's one particular type of containerization system, that's the one that we use as the starting point that we recommend. There's a variety of other starting points you can choose. In the end, though, starting off with the Docker container makes it much easier. So like I said, the image, containing everything, it's a layer. So think of it just like building a cake, right? So each piece is a separate component. And everything will be basically defined inside what's called a Docker file. And it goes in a sequence of building the layers. So you build the first layer, and then from that you start putting on the next layer, and the next layer, and the next layer. And that's part of what's called the build process. Okay. So we can see in this figure here, and taken from the source of link at the bottom, and I have a link showing to the main, I would say, getting started tutorial that people can go through afterwards as well. In the Docker file, you can see the first line, it just tells you what the base is. It tells you, okay, what to use as that very, very beginning base layer. And then you start adding things on, defining things, what you want to do, what you want to add and configure. I won't go through these particular ones here, but the key thing is you want to remember its layers. And the nice thing about being in layers is that when you're going through those layers, if you're, say, building it and then something goes a little bit wrong, you can actually then just jump right into each one of those layers in particular. You don't have to actually wait and say, go back, I'm going to just, take out one of these. You can actually go into each of the various layers and inspect those different layers, which is nice. So while it's exactly, like I said, a self-contained piece of, I would say, the environment that you would run that's very portable, containing all the dependencies, there's lots of advantages to this. It makes it highly movable. You can share it, you can publish it, and therefore it makes it very good for reproducibility. So then when you want to stay, making sure you want to use the same particular version of the software and its components, let's say it might have some different, library dependencies that may be not available on a particular system, but you can run it virtually, the container form. It makes it very capable for reproducibility. So that's one of the, say, key benefits coming from all this. So in terms of, I would say that's the foundation. The key thing if you think about just containers is just, like I said, a self-contained set of images that lets you put layers upon layers of things from a foundation upward that all the way includes your application that you're building. So the workflow when you bring in CBRAIN though, the first part of that, like I said, that layering is the Docker layer, right? Building that set of layers, which we would then convert in something called Apptainer, which used to be the name of, now is the name of something that used to be called Singularity. I won't go into the differences between a Docker container and Singularity container, other than suffice to say, the Apptainer ones are more secure. You don't run them as root. The Docker ones, they run as root on your system wherever you run them. And that is not a good thing. So the Singularity ones, though, they run it as a traditional basic user. So the access privileges of the system are much more secure. So don't run things in Docker unless it's something in an environment that you trust, and then where people just like your own VM on your instance on your laptop, that's fine. But on shared systems, you will not even see this. You can't run a Docker container on the Alliance or Compute Canada, for example. You need to convert those things into Singularity or what are called now Apptainer containers. So once you've done the conversion, you'll do something that's running the descriptor, which I've talked about before, will help keep track of the input-output parameters and then get the integration, but we're going to focus really on that first step today. So we're going to do some examples of how to work with Docker and containers based on that first sample there. So we can do some of this live. Okay. So the first thing what we're going to do, again, this is taking a base. Again, I'm not myself the expert in doing this, so I use myself as a guinea pig as the expression goes, right? If I can do it, hopefully means other people can do it. And part of this, you'll see some of the getting, at least the recommendations that at the end came from a result of me trying to understand a few things, because depending on where you're using Docker, you may see some differences based on versions, because Docker, as it moves along, has changed some things in terms of how it builds the containers. So if you're using on one system, make sure it's always good to know what version you're using there, because some of the features that I talk about may or may not be present. So the first thing we're going to do, just to keep it simple, I went through and said, well, when I'm learning, a good place to start is their particularly getting started pages. So I did this already, but I'm going to just remove it here. Okay. So these are another ones that later on we'll get to. So in this case, I'm just going to go through a basic exercise of getting an application. So they have a simple web-based application that's available on GitHub. This is what you might normally do, right? You're working on your code, you're pushing everything to GitHub. That's a good practice. Well, what we're going to do now is with the test application, we're going to pull it down. We're going to work with the Docker file and we're going to build it. And then we're going to see the steps as it walks through that build process. And you can see the different layers in terms of stages of how it goes through that cycle. And we'll do some things that will help you see how you can, for example, not only start the container, but you're also going to do things like tie it into, make it, have a persistent storage, that stuff that sticks around after. Because right now it's building it and you can say, well, this is just based upon the code. If I do my work on it and I make some changes and I stop it and go away and we start again, things won't be there anymore. There's ways you can tie it so that things will persist. There's ways you can tie it such that it also connects with your directory of, say, where you may be containing your data files on your local system. So you can be running a container that talks to your local system for data that you don't want to package into a container, because many times when we're processing data, you don't want to package the data with the container, because otherwise it's going to get very bloated, it can be very hard to move, and a lot of times you're not even able to move it inside of the image. In this first case, what I'm going to do is just do basically a clone of a particular, like I said, getting started one here. Just doing my cut and paste will work properly. So I'm just doing a git clone, like I said, of this particular getting started one. So I'm running this. I didn't go through the process. I can give some people some pointers if you're trying to install it locally on your own particular system. So I already went through the process of installing. I'm running a virtual machine here on my laptop. I installed the various packages needed for Docker directly. So that part I've left out, but I have notes that people I can share with afterwards if you want to install it yourself on your machine if you haven't already. Or, probably a better place if there's a common system that you and your lab have that can run people who provide the Docker tools, you can then run it there as well. And you don't have to worry about those particular pieces. It looks like our connection isn't that great. It's a lot of fun. You can see if you will see this okay, or I can zoom in. So right now it's just going to pulling it down since hopefully be done shortly. And then we'll take a look inside. Okay. So you can see this is the getting started app that's there. It's just a simple job out that's there. So you can see there's content in this particular repo here. Inside particularly doesn't exist here directly within because it didn't include it. But we're going to create what's called a Docker file. I'll go through some of the parts in terms of what it means here in a second. This stuff you don't want to put in a Docker. I'll explain it once I just put that in the Docker file. So with whatever editor you want. So what this Docker file, again, this is defining the layers. So I'm just moving this over. You can see. So the first line tells you the base layer. So the base layer essentially is what baseline type like operating system is. So these are standard images that are out there. You can build your own if you want. But there's always these reference images out there you can use as the base. Like there's Ubuntu, Fedora, things like that. This one contains a variety of things, including a bunch of dependencies. What I'm saying here is I'm going to take and give all these directives. One, like I said, this is the base it's coming from. The second one, I'm telling everything I want to put from the repo into, again, within the actual container image. I'm going to make a directory called my app, and I'm going to copy the contents that are local within this tree, right, that is the repository downloaded into that app directory. It does a run of a specific command, and then expose as particular network ports. That's port 3. So you get a variety of commands. Again, I'm not going to, there's a gazillion that you can choose from and how to do various things. But I'm just going to show you, this is the base here. So you give the specification. So again, the base, the working directory, what you want to copy into it from the repository that you cloned. You run this particular piece to launch the code and based on this entire index and expose it. This is a network interface. So in theory, this should tunnel this to a web browser interface on port 3000. And if you see, because we're not running anything now, I'm just saving the Docker file. In the Docker, you want to check the status of the different, containers are running by running some Docker under space PS. And you can see right now that there's nothing there. Nothing running. Normally, if there's a container running, you would see an ID number and name and so on, but there's nothing wrong because we haven't built anything. So I created the Docker file, so now I'm going to build that particular container. Then you can see a syntax, and this is just to me easier just to see by doing rather than trying to necessarily learn what everything means. So we're going to do it again. Now the Docker build command -T is just to give it a tag. What we're going to call it, say, just getting started. And dot means everything based upon the current directory. So it's going to look in the current directory for a Docker file, the one that we created. Let's see what it does for this one. Docker build my info. So you can see now it's going through the process of doing the build here. So it gives you a different step description of each. But it gives you the number. So you can see here 1 of 4. So the first step was, sorry, the blue doesn't turn on. So you can see the 1 of 4 from it takes the base image, right? This 18-Alpine. Second step is building the work directory. Step 3 is then copy. Step 4, again, each one of these steps corresponds to the line of the Docker file, right? So in this case, it's writing the images there. Now, one part, so this is building great, and you can say, well, everything built nicely because, of course, this happens to be a perfect Docker file already. Because of this being, say, the newest version of Docker, there's a way, as you'll see, tips-wise, getting somebody who'll want to get access to the intermediate layers. And there's a way of doing that. But as far as I can see, it doesn't apply to the newest version of this flag. So what you can do is, there's different, I would say, build kit version. The latest build kit method is different than the legacy, what they call a legacy one. Depending on which system you're using, you'll need to be aware of this. But if there's one environment variable, if you want to go back to the legacy one, the benefit of the legacy one is it provides you the ability to create intermediate images, intermediate layers. So then if, say, one of these portions fails and you want to jump in and see what it looks like in that layer, you can then say, jump in at step 1. You can jump in at step 2, 3, and not just wait to the end and try and debug from there. So I export this. Just import there. So just remember this. So I'm going to run the same build again. We should see different messaging. So you can see the different steps here now. There's more steps as listed. But what you're seeing here is each step, what it produces here, this is the image ID. So in the end, we produce the image that you'll see. The ID gets produced at the end. Actually didn't show it, did it? But what it's doing right now, like I said, is producing all the intermediate steps. So that way, if I need to jump in for any individual step that's in between, these are the IDs I'll want to know. They've not displayed when I did not have Docker build _build kit 0 legacy one. So that's one of these things that I include at the end. As a suggestion, it's a different build method within the same Docker environment. You can see, in this case, though, I also forgot to use one particular tip that I'll have at the end as well about keeping the intermediate containers. By default, it doesn't keep them. So it's kind of, I know, pointless to say, well, tell me the ID of the intermediate containers. But if I'm removing them, then it doesn't help. There's another flag that I'll show you at the end to actually add it such that it will keep intermediate layers and containers. So if we just go back to this original one here, we'll do the build with the original piece. And because of what it's doing, everything is much faster now because it was using a cache. So there's a nice built-in caching feature so that if you've gone through a step already and it needs to be redone, it just keeps it there. So it did that caching already, so I should unset that variable. Okay, so now it's produced the file image there, so for all those layers. And you can see that the image name is this long string here. So now that we built it, that's great. So now we want to run it. There's a command specifically to run it now. In this case, we want to start that Docker instance. So much akin to there's the Docker command that lets you say Docker PS is much like you do a PS for command line syntax for checking the processes. See that there's nothing running currently now. I'm going to start one here. I'm just going to do it all one time and to make sure I don't mess up with it. Commands. There we go. There we go. So now we see Docker PS running. So now this shows, I'm just going to span this a little bit so it fits a little bit nicely. So now we can see when you do the Docker PS, the container ID that's producing there, the input I should have just exclusively given, not the hash of the image. Was the image name, which I gave it was getting started when we produced it, right? It tells you information about how long it's been running, so on, and tells you also information about the port mapping, which is important to as well. So that way, depending on where you're running the Docker command and where how you're connecting to it, you'll want to understand and set that port mapping. And you can change the names, but by default, it gives you a randomly generated name. So sometimes you get very interesting things that are put there in terms of the name. So this is still running, which is great there. So now if I go to my local browser here, I want to just connect to port localhost 3000. Before, it would not have responded. So this is what the app is. The app is just essentially a simple making your to-do list. So the app is responding. So I've got my tunnel rigs, my SSH port mapping that gets me in there. So that's good. So this is now responding. So if I were to take this container offline, so if I look at, let's see. Docker. So there's commands like, for example, just even Docker stuff. Then that's when I give the actual container ID. So the Docker container stopped, and I go back to my browser. I reload. It's not reachable because it doesn't respond. The container is not running, so I'm not getting anything. Okay. Let's go back to this. So again, so this is now the same thing. Like I said, just showing on the screen what was I just displayed to you guys here. The thing, like I said, keep in mind, if you're running this on a local system, remote, you have to make sure you keep up your tunneling properly. So then when I did my initial setup, connecting in via SSH to my VM, I made sure I did my tunnel mapping. So this is an important thing to keep in mind if you're doing a connection to the remote system, so that it's okay if you're running directly on a Linux system, say, which is your laptop, or in my case, I'm going into another machine to run Docker, which that Docker is being run on that VM, so I have to do the tunnels. And so it's something to keep in mind. And this is just going to be the slides to show you how that tunnel is set up. So now the thing is, okay, great. Well, that's one thing. It's not very exciting. You downloaded some code, you built a container, but you want to do something with it. You want to do things where you edit it, you change things, and you want to rebuild the container as well. But then you also want to do more things like start maybe tying into local storage. So just as an example, we'll edit some of the code. So this is in there. So if I go into the source, let's see this one. Stop.js. So I'm just going to edit something in there so we can see what the difference was. I think they were talking about go to, so if I looked at the browser, say I want to change the message, right now it said no items yet. Okay, really, you have no items left. So you make the change, then we can just go the exact same thing. I've saved it, go back to my directory above where the Docker file is. I do the exact same thing. I can do the Docker build. Do the exact same thing again, but now the container should have the changes that were made on the code. Once the build's done this last step there, we'll go through and we'll start and we'll see if we made the changes. So this is just part of that cycle of you're doing this as more of a development environment as well, which is a nice thing to use it for building that base layer of information. That way, once you get to the end, things can then more easily progress to distributing it. This is on my local VM. A little bit of extra time. I didn't give the no cap option in case it's pulling things again. Which we're going to look at that. We'll let that go in the background. So you should be able to look side by side, run the container again, and then you'll be able to see exactly the change that you made. While that goes, we'll let that run. You see now it's exporting the layers. The part you'll want to leave. Okay, that's all finished. So you can trust me that it's all changed and run. See, it did make my change into the code. That's fine. Part we'll go to next, though, is at least to understand some of the container pieces that let you then start connecting with other data spaces and other file systems. So really with Docker and file systems, it gives you a way of keeping data persistent, but a lot of times you won't want to keep it in the container itself, right? Sometimes you will. For example, each layer can actually be, something that gets updated dynamically, and they're unique. So when you run it, you get it to your own scratch space. So it's something that's temporarily provided at runtime. You don't have to worry about designating it. It's automatically created in the container. But it's not part of the image, right? So the image is the thing that you move around. The container, when you spawn it, creates its own workspace for things will persist within that container for the duration the image is running. But many times, like I said, you don't want to attach things to it that are not directly within the container itself. So say there's data spaces that are on your local machine that you want to tie into, you want to be able to mount those, just like you would mount them on another Linux machine. You're going to be able to mount things within your container. So that way, when you say, for example, say you have some data that is located directly on your machine, but is accessed by the container. Well, you want to be able to have it such that things that Docker is nice. If you make a change on your local machine, the Docker image, even while it's running, will see that change immediately. And that way, when you do change your container, the file that you create on your local machine persists. You can make, if it's your data files, you don't want to tie it in and put it in your container. You can keep it local to your machine and it keeps the container size down and focuses on the code. So something that you can do that. Now I'll show one example of doing that. And Docker is very nice. It lets you manage those volumes, storage locations. There's tons of options. But for the basic one, I'll give you some examples of that. So what we're going to do now is, we're going to say mount. There's a variety of options that you can add to it. I'm going to skip to, let's see here. All right, this is a good one. We're going to show you the one where it keeps it persistent, and then when you stop and start the container again, so say you make changes, you can saw, if you remember before, my to-do list, this was a web app that's just lets you create a to-do list that was empty, that had nothing in, right? What this will now do with these options is it'll actually keep that information and store it back into the container, and that when you come back, you'll be able to see the contents as you left it off. So in this case, you do the same Docker run command, you do the same port mapping, you want to detach from output, and it's these extra options of the mount, the volume. So this is basically storing it inside the container with this position. So this is not, again, this is not yet local to the machine that you're running, your direct local machine, but it's going to store it for the container specifications. So it'll persist there. So let's try running this container, the one that I built. Paste correctly or not. Find out already. Because I was running it over. Stop that. Again, we're going to use these other mount options. Again, this is internal to the container itself, so that it is make sure that it persists afterwards. So if I start it now, so I see it's running. I check my local port again on the device. Now I should get a list. Same thing should stay there. Now, the reason why you see this, it pulled from the same information that I had done before. So I had entered a to-do list before. 2 days ago, myself, remind myself, wash my car, dry my car, clean the interior, or it was either myself or ask my teenage kids to do it. Of course, they didn't do it. All right. So this is a list that I actually created before, but because I gave it the same specification as I did previously, pulling it from that prior image and pulling it in. So this way you can see something persisted. So this is where you can give a continuation of what you might have been working on before. So I'll stop this one. I want to give it a different name. So let's just say you don't want to see my list of, say, car washing, which is my to-do list to do. Let's just, because it'd be completely new then. So really should now it's an empty list. All right. So let's see. Step number 1, give HIBALL talk. About Docker. Okay, so these things I've entered into the list. Now I can stop the container. Again, I need to know the PS of the ID. So if I do actually PS to them. There's another option that lets you do the bind, what are called bind mounts. Bind mounts is another way of doing the mounts, but then, like I said, that's a more interesting case where you can actually see things directly on your shared directory from your host machine, right? So that way your container can see specifically something local to your system. So that way you can see things, instantaneously that occur, and you can even do things like have processes running that watch for changes on the file or the file system, and have it correspondingly make changes on the fly based in the code based upon what files are there. So we're going to give an example of you doing the bind mounts. So I'm just going to stop this one. Okay. So now what we're going to try and do, like I said, is with this bind mount option, go through and give us some extra parameters such that it's going to share the current working directory. But this will just show you an example of going into that same into that, I'll say a different layer, but using a different container that exists. This is just an example. So we're going to start with here now the same Docker run, but we're just going to actually start with an Ubuntu image and just give ourselves a bash shell. We're going to do Docker run as IT. So that means we're just going to jump right into that container. IT just means more interactive part. Mount and type equals bind source equals WD. So my current working directory in there. Bash. Okay, so it's brought me into a container based upon an Ubuntu image bash. So I'm going to show you a couple things. So I'm just doing a listing. This is inside the container. You can see, but now because of the directive I gave it, remember source was the print working directory. Print working directory prior was the actual app directory, so getting started, right? So that tells it bind it means take that source directory and make it visible within the container at the /source directory. So if I go to cd/source, these are the contents on my machine for that particular getting started package. So these are things outside the container, but I've exported them through or made them visible through the bind mount. So that way, for example, if I do something like, create a file, and say do something that says, I'm going to just create an empty file, touch my file as just create this. Well, mind you, I did it there. I should have done it in the other way. Go back to the other way. It's the place where I should have done it. So this is again on the virtual machine where I'm running Docker, but this is the actual container image that's running. Right? You can tell the difference between here I'm just my regular user on that machine, and here it's because they're using Docker, it puts you in as root. So that's the difference there. So if I go into my getting started app, remember the converse way as well. I created that touch file directly within the container. It now exists directly on the local file system. So that we can see there's things that you can move back and forth and see back and forth between them. So just like in this example, I did the reverse. Well, it's the same way. Actually, I created the file directly on the container. It's now visible on the host. And it can be applied vice versa. That way you can actually then have things resident outside. You don't put your data files in there. You keep it focused on the code and you keep your data outside, but you can still mount it. See, and the last one I'm going to show. So the idea is that, it lets you actually do things where you can keep making changes. You don't have to then do, say, a Docker run every single time you want to make a change and see things. You can actually keep things live with the code running, make the changes, and there's a feature within the Docker side that's called no daemon that will actually watch for file system changes. So what we're going to do is we're just going to stop this now here. So I'll exit this. Stop this one. Now, because I exited that one directly, there's nothing already running because I did the exit. So that wasn't the same one that we ran before. So I'm going to start the same thing. I'm going to keep the same bind mount, but I'm going to apply the bind mount to the command that I ran for the container that we were developing at this getting started piece. Just go through this. The cut and paste doesn't change things. So I have Docker run. I'm going to do the mapping again, port 3000, and tell it to working directory /app. The mount is correct in these cutting and pasting. Target is there, so I'm running again this base image, and I'm going to run and drop me into a shell. So remember, this is all really one part of that readme the Docker file. Let me just go through or do this. All right, so this is essentially the last part or one of the steps within the container. It's pretty close to it. So that runs now. So what we're going to do as part of this, what you'll see, go back to port 3000. So this way you can actually keep it running, but then now I'm saying I'm inside my directory and go into the source file. And I'm just going to make another change. I want to make a change. I'll say something. Just if it's like instead of I'm saying really, I'm saying wow, really. I'll do something just basic text. I've saved it, and now I just go to the page. On the page there, and again, I don't have to rebuild things. There we go. So this way, the container's running. You don't have to do the stuff. You don't have to do the build. You don't have to do the start or the run. You can just make your changes on the fly. Depending, of course, depends on your application. This is just an example of a simple one here. I think what we're just trying to show you though is that you're able to work and directly connect with the local file system the key thing, particularly for things like data files or reference files that you need to package along with your container, don't put them in the container. You can always put them in a separate image. You can also have them locally available in another directory which you can point to. That way it keeps, again, the sizes down. So just a couple things. So there's some much more concrete examples. But hopefully from this, you can see some of the basics. So, I know the people who are familiar with Docker already will find this very, very simplistic rudimentary. It was good for me to go through and do it as well. But you can see some more, I would say, ones oriented towards, I would say, the neuroinformatics side. We have containers, and specifically Docker files, and even the singularity pieces, which are like the app container next parts. Some recipes specifically in our Git repo. So we go to this particular link here. Again, I'll share the link afterwards. We have ones that are there. There's different ones depending on whether it's tools like FSL. The one thing to particularly keep in mind, because of the dependencies that some of these have, they're based upon sometimes in this case of FSL right now. I have it running, trying to build a container on another machine that's probably still running right now. It's doing some updates based upon CentOS 7, so it's doing some updates. So the build process can take time and a lot of space, depending on what dependencies are there. So that's one example there. And another one that's a good example of another tool that was integrated is something called PyLossless for doing EEG analysis within CBRAIN. The link is there. But one of the nice things, if you look and download the package in the Docker file that's there, it's a very rather short Docker file, but it's a really good reference point. And this is one that was built together in conjunction with Pierre of our team and a few others, between the developer with some advice coming from Pierre. So you can see in this case, so let's look at the Docker file part. Like I said, there's the base layer course. It takes, I should just do it in my terminal. Again, the base OS layer coming from a particular update there, from a particular version. There's updates, so everything gets done in this case. Keep in mind, Docker is run as root, right? So you do things like update the packages, so you update the OS, right? And you have any dependencies that you install. So you'll need to know, if you're bringing your tool, what software dependencies you have that are maybe, say, not part of the base install coming from the base image. So you have to go through, there's some work to find those, and you have to go through and document those so that you can know which packages you're installing. Again, because it's all running as root, you want to make sure the application, even if you're running in Docker, a lot of times you're going to switch to being an alternative user. You don't want to run as root. So that's why you do this user add. You run it as root. You're adding a base user. In this case, because of the PyLossless app, they call it just the PyLossless with username. So that way, the files that are there, when it is run as a regular user. So then you switch that user, and you've already specified, the working directory for the user is being /PyLossless. So there's a corresponding non-root user with a non-root directory. You want to keep that in mind. So that creating that local root user is important. You can install the package pieces then inside that work directory. All this is done as well because it's, installing the package there as a user. You want to make sure that you're changing the ownership. You're creating the user and you're running that as user, but the run is actually still being done as root. So this is actually going through and changing it. So that is still, again, the run as user. And same thing with copying external files. You want all those files, again, these were from Bryan mouse that get run, if I remember correctly. So these get copied in. And then as user root, you're going to make sure that these directories, pardon me, I was wrong about my statement in this part. So these are, again, all run as the user. But at the end, as root, you're going to switch back to user root, and you're going to make sure that those files get switched back to being the root user, because when you do that, it makes sure all the permissions are done correctly. So keeping in mind that you do actions within this as not as root, because essentially you're root on the local system where you're running Docker. That's why sometimes you'll notice when you're on a system with Docker, it may not work if you're not in the Docker group. Right. If you're sharing a system with many people, you have to be part of that Docker group, and therefore it has to be a trusted environment. So making sure, keeping track of package permissions, make sure you get the dependencies and you set the ownership of the group in the end. This is just one example of the best practices that we passed on in working with the developer for the integration piece. Some other things that, at least going through some of the exercises, like I said, I did this on 2 different systems, one with an older version of Docker, one with a new one, so I saw some subtle differences. Things to keep in mind on the new one, particularly, I think I was pointing out before, there were certain options you had to do if you wanted to keep the intermediate images, and you can go through and jump in. As I was doing that on my local VM, I had to revert to the legacy build kit by setting this environment variable. Otherwise, it wasn't even displaying the IDs of the intermediate containers. So that's something you'll want to do. I'm not aware of a workaround with regard to that, but that's something at least in certain short order. And you want to keep those intermediate images. By default, it will actually, when you switch to using the legacy build kit, --rm for remove is by default taken as true. So it's going to delete those intermediate images. So then if you're building things and you want to try and debug what's going on and you want to jump into those layers by setting it to false, you can actually then find and get access to those intermediate layers. Of course, obviously, if you're familiar already, man pages are always good places to check, but sometimes they're not always correctly up to date. For example, there was things about using the latest version that made no reference to regard to the build kit and so on. So that I had to find a little bit extra. So just as a last part, just taking some time, I've gone through really of the 3 real steps that we have. This is just part 1 of working with Docker. We have some additional other documentation. So if you want to go through, first of all, and recreate, if you're brand new, I've done a little bit before, but it's been a few years, so I went through back to the beginning part. All the exercises I took and used were from the Docker Getting Started page. On our particular documentation, we talk a little bit more in depth about the stages and the steps. But like I said, once you build your Docker image, taking into account some of the best practices, you'll want to then convert that to an htps container, right? That's the one that's, like I said, is more secure and that's fully runnable within the HPC system environment. Otherwise, Docker, you can't run it anywhere else other than your local machine or a trusted environment that might be separate. But on the Alliance systems, it has to be htps. And so we have some information about converting that. And that's where you then, you can run your htps container separately there, but also then bring into CBRAIN is the boutiques part, where we have some information online about that, how to create a boutiques descriptor. And also even in our documentation, we talk about one of the tools we have already within CBRAIN, essentially is a boutiques descriptor maker. So it helps you can help create that JSON file directly within the tool, and then it'll run it and check and validate some pieces. So that's a good tool to use for that. Then, of course, once you get through those 2 steps, you're then able to have the tool running in CBRAIN. Then we make a linkage to the tool within the inventory. But really, this is the first step. So foundationally, working and getting familiar with the Docker tools are really key in doing that. So that's it. Same finish. If you have any questions, let me know. I can guarantee, at least the Docker side, like I said, I imagine people on the table here and on the other end of the line are much more versed at it than I am. And but nonetheless, if there's any questions that you have specifically about bringing things into the CBRAIN environment, just reach out to us. And just a big thanks to my colleagues that I chatted with and got prepared with, and all the tools that they make available for getting this available on CBRAIN. That's my story for this morning, and I'm sticking to it. So.